Part 1. Meeting in the Blizzard. The wind howled through the Bitterroot Mountains like a creature gone mad, carrying snow so thick a man couldn't see his own boots. Elias Boone pulled his bearskin coat tighter and squinted into the white wall that had been his world for 3 days running. December of 1882 had come down hard on Montana territory, and this storm was the worst he'd seen in his 15 years living alone in these peaks. His cabin sat tucked in a grove of towering pines, smoke curling from its stone chimney into the gray sky. Elias had enough jerky, beans, and coffee to last the winter, plus a decent store of firewood stacked against the north wall. A man learned to prepare for such things when he lived this far from civilization, where the nearest neighbor was a 2-day ride down treacherous mountain paths. He'd been checking his trap lines that morning, though the storm made it near impossible. Most creatures had the good sense to hole up and wait out nature's fury. Still, a man had to check. Traps left too long could mean lost pelts, and pelts meant trade goods come spring. The wind shifted, and through its constant moan, Elias heard something else. He stopped, one hand on the pine trunk beside him, and listened. There it was again, a sound that didn't belong to the storm, weak, almost lost in the gale, but unmistakably human. Someone was crying. Elias knew every sound these mountains made. He knew the crack of branch under snow weight, the whistle of wind through rock formations, the distant howl of wolves. This was different. This was pain, and it was close. He followed the sound, his worn boots crunching through snow that reached past his knees. The crying grew stronger, mixed with something that might have been words, though the wind tore them away before he could make sense of them. His hand moved instinctively to the knife at his belt. In 15 years of mountain living, he'd learned that unexpected sounds usually meant trouble. The pine grove grew thicker here, branches heavy with snow creating a maze of white and shadow. Elias pushed through, following that thread of human misery through the storm. His breath came in white puffs, his beard already crusted with ice. Then he saw her. She was tied to a massive pine, rope cutting into her wrists where they were bound behind the tree. Her dress, what remained of it, was torn and stained, offering little protection against the bitter cold. Dark hair hung in wet tangles around a face marked with fresh bruises. She couldn't have been out here long, or she'd already be dead. Her lips were blue, her whole body shaking with cold and something deeper, the kind of trembling that came from fear as much as freezing. When she saw him approach, her eyes went wide with terror. "Please," she whispered through chattering teeth, "please don't. I can't." "Easy now," Elias said, his voice rusty from disuse. He didn't talk much these days, having no one to talk to. "I'm going to cut you free." His knife made quick work of the rope. Whoever had tied her here had used coarse hemp that bit deep into her skin. When the bonds fell away, she collapsed forward, her legs unable to hold her weight. Elias caught her before she hit the snow. She was lighter than she should have been, all sharp angles under the torn fabric. Her skin was ice cold, and he could feel her heart racing like a trapped bird's. She tried to speak, but only a strangled sound came out. "Can you walk?" he asked. She shook her head, teeth chattering too hard for words. Without another thought, Elias lifted her in his arms. She weighed nothing, this broken woman the storm had delivered to his doorstep. He turned toward home, following his own tracks back through the maze of snow-laden pines. The walk to his cabin felt longer than usual, fighting the wind with a burden in his arms. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes murmuring words he couldn't catch, sometimes going limp as death. He checked her breathing more than once, pressing his ear close to her lips to feel the weak puff of air that meant she still lived. His cabin appeared through the white like salvation itself, rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss, a door thick enough to keep out bears and bitter cold alike. Elias kicked it open and carried her inside, where warmth from the banked fire hit them like a physical force. He laid her on his own bed, the only bed in the one-room cabin, and covered her with every blanket and fur he owned. The bear skin that usually served as his winter coat went over everything else. Her shivering was violent now, her body trying to warm itself back to life. Elias built up the fire until it roared in the stone hearth, then put water on to heat. He'd tended enough wounded animals to know that warmth had to come slow, or it could kill as sure as the cold. He heated stones in the fire and wrapped them in cloth, placing them carefully around her feet and hands. Only then did he get a proper look at what had been done to her. The bruises on her face were fresh, purple and swollen around her left eye, finger marks on her throat. Her wrists were raw from the rope, bleeding in places. But it was her eyes that told the real story. They held the kind of emptiness that came after something inside had been broken. She was awake now, watching him with the wariness of a cornered animal. When he moved to check the bandages he'd wrapped around her wrists, she flinched away. "I won't hurt you," he said quietly. "Then what's your name?" For a long moment she didn't answer, then barely audible. Clara Hensley. "I'm Elias Boone. This is my home." He gestured around the cabin, rough but solid. Everything a man needed and nothing he didn't. "You're safe here." She looked around the cabin with growing awareness. The single room held his bed, a table and chair, shelves lined with supplies, hooks where his traps and tools hung. Animal pelts covered the floor and walls. A lifetime of solitary living, laid bare. "Where did they find you?" Elias asked, spooning heated broth into a wooden bowl. Clara's hands shook as she tried to hold the bowl. The warmth of it seemed to steady her some. "The mining camp," she said. "Down by Willow Creek. I worked in the cook tent." Elias knew the place. A rough collection of tents and lean-tos where men dug silver from the mountainside and spent their earnings on whiskey and worse. No place for a decent woman. But these were hard times. People did what they had to do to survive. "Who tied you to that tree?" Her face went hard, and for a moment the fear left her eyes, replaced by something fiercer. "Vernon Tate, the mine foreman." She sipped the broth, her voice growing stronger. He thought I owed him something more than cooking meals. When I told him no, he said I was stealing food, said I was a thief. She met Elias's eyes. "I'm not a thief. I never figured you were." He had 3 of his men drag me up here, tied me to that tree and said the mountain could have me. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Said no one would miss a thieving woman anyway." Elias felt something cold settle in his chest. Not the mountain cold, but the colder anger that came when a man heard about cruelty done to those who couldn't fight back. He'd left civilization behind 15 years ago partly because of men like Vernon Tate, men who thought strength gave them the right to take whatever they wanted. "They were wrong," he said simply. Clara looked at him over the rim of the bowl, studying his face in the firelight. He was a hard-looking man. She could see that, weathered by wind and sun, scarred on his hands and forearms from years of rough living. His hair and beard were more gray than brown, his eyes the color of winter sky. But there was no cruelty in those eyes, no meanness, just a steady calm, like still water. "Why did you help me?" she asked. Elias considered the question while he stirred the fire. Why had he? In 15 years of mountain living, he'd made it a point to avoid other people's troubles. He came up here to escape the complications that people brought with them. But when he'd heard her crying in the storm, he hadn't even thought about walking away. I couldn't leave you to die, he said finally. Wouldn't be right. Outside, the wind continued its assault on the cabin walls, but inside was warmth and shelter and something Clara hadn't known in a long time. Safety. She finished the broth and set the bowl aside, then looked around the cabin again. I don't have anywhere to go, she said quietly. Elias banked the fire for the night and checked that the door was secure. Storm's got 3 more days in it, by my figuring. We'll worry about tomorrow when tomorrow comes. He made himself a bed on the floor near the fire, rolling himself in a single blanket while she kept the warm spot in the actual bed. As the cabin settled into the quiet rhythms of night, Clara lay listening to the storm rage outside and to the steady breathing of the man who had saved her life. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something like peace. The mountain had tried to claim her, but the mountain man had said no. And in the warm glow of the dying fire, with snow piling against the windows and the wind singing its wild song, Clara Hensley began to believe she might survive after all. Part 2. The first light. Clara woke to the sound of wood splitting and the warm smell of coffee brewing. For a moment, she lay still, confused by the unfamiliar surroundings. Then memory returned. The storm, the tree, the mountain man who had saved her life. She was in Elias Boone's cabin, wrapped in furs and blankets, alive when she should have been dead. Outside the single window, snow still fell in thick curtains, though the wind had gentled some from the howling fury of the night before. The cabin felt like a small island of warmth and safety in an ocean of white wilderness. Elias stood at the wooden table, his back to her, grinding coffee beans with practiced efficiency. He moved quietly for such a large man, each motion deliberate and economical. She watched him work, noting how he seemed to fill the small space without crowding it, how he belonged here in a way she had never belonged anywhere. "You're awake," he said without turning around, somehow sensing her watchfulness. "Yes." Her voice came out as a croak. Her throat felt raw, whether from the cold or from screaming. She couldn't remember. He poured steaming coffee into a tin cup and brought it to her, along with a plate of cornbread and bacon. The simple kindness of it, hot food, warm drink, no questions asked, made her eyes burn with unexpected tears. "Thank you," she whispered. Elias nodded and returned to his work, giving her space to eat and gather herself. In the morning light filtering through the window, she could see him more clearly than she had by firelight. He was older than she'd first thought, probably in his 40s, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. His hands were scarred and calloused, the hands of a man who worked with rope and steel and sharp things. But those same hands had been gentle when they cut her free, careful when they tended her wounds. She ate slowly, her stomach protesting the rich food after days of little eating. The bruises on her face throbbed with each chew, and she caught Elias glancing at her with concern. "How bad do I look?" she asked, touching her swollen eye gingerly. "You look like someone who fought back," he said simply. The words surprised her. Most men would have focused on her appearance, on the damage done. But Elias saw something else, the resistance that had gotten her into this trouble in the first place. "I should have just kept quiet," she said bitterly. "Should have done what he wanted and stayed alive." Elias stopped stirring the pot of oatmeal he was preparing and looked at her directly. "Would you still be alive, though? The real you?" The question hung in the air between them. Clara stared into her coffee, seeing her reflection wavering in the dark surface. Would she have been alive, or just breathing? She thought of the other women at the mining camp, the ones who had learned to keep their eyes down and their mouths shut, who moved through each day like ghosts of themselves. "Maybe not," she admitted. "Then you did right." He said it with such quiet certainty that Clara felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. When was the last time someone had told her she'd done right? When had anyone looked at her choices and seen strength instead of foolishness? Elias finished preparing breakfast and sat across from her at the small table. They ate in comfortable silence. The only sounds the crackling of the fire and the steady whisper of snow against the windows. Clara found herself studying his face, trying to read the man who had taken her in without question. "How long have you lived up here?" she asked finally. 15 years, come spring." "Alone?" "Mostly." She wanted to ask why. What had driven him to this solitary existence? But something in his manner warned her away from the question. Instead, she looked around the cabin, taking in details she'd missed in her exhausted state the night before. Everything had its place and purpose. Traps hung from wooden pegs, their steel jaws clean and well-oiled. Shelves held neat rows of preserved food, ammunition, tools. Animal pelts were stretched on frames or folded in tidy stacks. It was the home of a man who had learned to depend entirely on himself. "You must know every inch of these mountains," she said. "Most of them." Elias refilled her coffee cup. "Know where the game runs, where the water flows clean, which passes stay open in winter. And people leave you alone up here?" "That's the idea." Clara caught something in his tone, a weariness that spoke of disappointments she couldn't fathom. Here was a man who had deliberately put himself beyond the reach of civilization, who had chosen isolation over whatever complications came with human company. Yet he had helped her, taken her in, shared his food and warmth. "Why did you come up here?" she asked softly. Elias was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, as if he was looking back across years she couldn't see. "Had a farm once, down in the valley. Wife, too." He paused, his fingers tracing the grain of the wooden table. "Cholera took her. Then the bank took the farm. Seemed like there wasn't much point in staying around folks after that." The simple words carried a weight of grief that made Clara's own troubles feel small in comparison. She had lost her job, her safety, nearly her life. But Elias had lost everything that mattered to him, had watched it all slip away beyond his power to save. "I'm sorry," she said, meaning it. He nodded acknowledgement but didn't elaborate. Instead, he rose and began clearing the breakfast dishes. Moving with the same quiet efficiency she was beginning to recognize as his natural way. Clara tried to help, but when she stood too quickly, dizziness washed over her and she had to sit back down. The cold, the fear, the violence of the past few days had taken more out of her than she'd realized. "Rest," Elias said not unkindly. "Your body's got healing to do." She watched him work, washing dishes in a basin of heated water, banking the fire, checking supplies with the methodical care of someone for whom preparation meant survival. There was something soothing about his quiet competence, the way he moved through familiar routines without wasted motion. "The storm's letting up some," he observed, glancing toward the window. Clara followed his gaze. The snow was still falling, but lighter now, and she could make out the shapes of pine trees through the white veil. Will you take me down to town when it stops?" Elias considered this, his face unreadable. Where would you go? The question hit her with unexpected force. Where would she go? She had no family, no friends who would risk crossing Vernon Tate. The little money she'd managed to save was probably gone, taken when they searched her belongings for evidence of theft. "I don't know," she admitted. "Tate's got friends in most of the towns around here, miners, businessmen. They'll believe his story about you being a thief." Clara felt the walls closing in again, the same trapped feeling that had driven her to resist Vernon's advances in the first place. So what am I supposed to do? Hide up here forever? Maybe not forever, Elias said quietly. But until we figure something else out. The we surprised her. This man who had chosen solitude, who had deliberately cut himself off from the complications of human connection, was including her in his plans. She studied his face, trying to understand what motivated such unexpected generosity. Well, why would you do that? You don't even know me. Elias was quiet for a moment, looking out at the snow-covered wilderness beyond his window. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. A man makes a choice to live apart from people. He tells himself it's because people are trouble. And they are. Lord knows they are. But sometimes, he paused, searching for words. Sometimes you meet someone who reminds you why you used to think people were worth the trouble. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. I'm nothing but trouble. Look what happened just from me saying no to one man. You stood up for yourself, and that takes courage. Courage? Clara laughed bitterly. I ended up tied to a tree, left to die. That's not courage, that's stupidity. Elias turned from the window to look at her directly, his winter sky eyes serious. You think courage means never getting hurt? Never ending up in a bad spot? He shook his head. Courage is knowing you might get hurt and doing what's right anyway. You could have given that man what he wanted, kept yourself safe. But you didn't. That's courage, Clara Hensley. The way he said her name, with quiet respect, made something inside her chest flutter like a bird taking wing. When was the last time someone had spoken to her like she mattered? Like her choices had value beyond their convenience to others? I don't feel very courageous, she said softly. A courage isn't a feeling, it's a choice. Elias returned to his work, checking the seals around the windows, adding wood to the fire. And you're still here, still fighting. That tells me you'll keep making the right choices even when they're hard. They spent the rest of the day in quiet companionship. Clara dozed fitfully, her body demanding rest even as her mind churned with uncertainty about the future. Elias moved around the cabin with practiced silence, tending to small tasks, oiling leather, sharpening knives, mending a tear in one of his shirts. As evening approached, he prepared a simple dinner of venison stew and biscuits. The rich smell filled the cabin, making Clara's mouth water despite her lingering soreness. This is good, she said after tasting the stew. My Martha taught me to cook, Elias said, then seemed surprised he'd mentioned his wife's name. She must have been a good teacher. She was good at most everything. His voice carried the particular fondness of old grief, love that had outlasted loss. Said a man who couldn't feed himself properly had no business living alone in the wilderness. She was probably right. Usually was. Clara smiled despite herself. Sounds like a wise woman. Wiser than me, that's certain. Elias refilled her bowl. She'd have liked you, I think. Would have admired your backbone. The comment warmed Clara more than the food. To be approved of by this man's dead wife, this woman she would never meet but who had clearly been the love of his life, it felt like a benediction, a welcome into something precious. As they finished eating, Clara found herself studying Elias's hands again. They were strong hands, capable hands, but gentle when they needed to be. She thought of how carefully he had cut the ropes that bound her, how he had lifted her like she was made of something fragile and valuable. Up here, she said suddenly, I don't have to bow my head to anyone, do I? Elias met her eyes across the small table. No, ma'am. Up here, you hold your head exactly as high as you please. Outside, the storm continued its retreat, the wind gentling to a whisper, the snow falling soft and straight. Inside the cabin, Two damaged souls shared warmth and food and the beginning of something that might, in time, become trust. Clara pulled the bearskin closer around her shoulders and allowed herself to believe, just for tonight, that she had found a place where she could heal, where standing up for herself was seen as courage rather than foolishness, where a mountain man with winter sky eyes had looked at her broken state and seen someone worth saving. Part 3. Shadows from the valley below. The storm broke on the fourth day, leaving the world wrapped in pristine white silence. Clara woke to brilliant sunlight streaming through the cabin window and the sound of Elias splitting wood outside. She felt stronger than she had since arriving, the constant ache in her bones finally beginning to fade. She dressed carefully in the spare clothes Elias had found for her, a wool shirt that had belonged to his late wife, pants that she had to roll up at the cuffs, and thick socks that came nearly to her knees. Looking at herself in the small mirror above his wash basin, she hardly recognized the woman staring back. The bruises were fading to yellow-green, and there was something different in her eyes, not the defeated emptiness of a few days ago, but a cautious hope. Elias came in stamping snow from his boots, his arms full of split pine. "Morning," he said, noting she was up and dressed. "Sleep better?" "Much better." She helped him stack the wood beside the fireplace. "The world looks different when the sun's shining." "Always does." He poured coffee from the pot that seemed to perpetually simmer on the stove. "Figure I'll check the trap lines today, see what the storm brought down." Clara nodded, understanding this was mountain routine. Check the traps, tend the animals, prepare for the next challenge nature would surely provide. She had been living in his world for 4 days now, seeing how a man survived alone in this beautiful, brutal place. They were finishing breakfast when they heard hoofbeats approaching through the snow. Elias's head came up like a wolf scenting danger, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle that hung above the fireplace. "Stay back from the window," he said quietly, and Clara heard the change in his voice, the easy morning calm replaced by something harder. The rider was a woman. Clara could see through a gap in the curtains, bundled in a heavy coat and riding a sturdy bay horse that steamed in the cold air. She dismounted at the cabin's front step and called out, "Elias Boone, it's Sarah Martinez from the way station. I need to speak with you." Elias relaxed slightly but kept the rifle in easy reach as he opened the door. "Sarah, long way to ride in this weather." Sarah Martinez was a weathered woman in her 50s, with steel-gray hair and the kind of steady eyes that came from years of dealing with rough men and hard times. She ran the way station down at Copper Creek, one of the few stopping points between the mining camps and the larger towns to the east. "He had to come," Sarah said, stepping inside and nodding politely to Clara. "There's trouble brewing, and it concerns your houseguest." Clara felt her stomach drop. She had known this peaceful interlude couldn't last, but she had hoped for more time. "What kind of trouble?" Elias asked, offering Sarah coffee. "That mine foreman, Vernon Tate, came through my place yesterday with 2 of his men. Mean-looking types, the kind that solve problems with their fists." Sarah wrapped her hands around the warm cup. "They were asking about a woman who stole money from the camp payroll, said she was dangerous, probably armed." "And you told them?" "Told them I hadn't seen hide nor hair of any woman," which was true at the time. Sarah's eyes found Clara's. "But I've got good ears, miss, and I know when someone's spinning lies. That man had the look of someone who'd been crossed and didn't much like it." Clara sank into the chair beside the table. "He's telling people I'm a thief." "More than that," Sarah continued grimly. "He's posted a reward, $50 for information leading to your capture. Says you took the camp's winter supply money and disappeared into the mountains. $50 was more money than most people in these parts saw in 6 months. Clara felt the walls closing in again, the brief sense of safety crumbling around her. A $50 will bring every bounty hunter and desperate man within 100 miles. Elias said, his voice tight with anger. Already has, Sarah confirmed. I saw 3 different groups heading up into the high country yesterday. Word spreads fast when there's that kind of money involved. Clara stood abruptly, pacing to the window. The beautiful white landscape that had seemed so peaceful an hour ago now felt like a trap. I have to leave. I won't bring that kind of trouble down on you. Elias, where would you go? Sarah asked gently. You wouldn't last 2 days alone out there, and every town between here and Denver will have heard Tate's story by now. Then what am I supposed to do? Clara's voice cracked with frustration and fear. Hide up here forever while men hunt me like an animal? Elias was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee. When he looked up, his face was set with the kind of determination Clara was beginning to recognize. We make it too costly for them to keep looking, he said. What do you mean? Sarah asked. Men like that. They're bullies. They count on people being too scared or too weak to fight back. Elias stood and began pacing the small cabin. But they're also cowards at heart. Make it dangerous enough to come after what they want, and they'll find easier prey. Clara shook her head. You can't fight them all, Elias, and you shouldn't have to. This is my problem. No, he said firmly. The moment I cut you free from that tree, it became our problem. The simple declaration sent warmth through Clara's chest, but also terror. I won't let you get hurt because of me, and I won't let them take you back to face whatever justice Vernon Tate has in mind. Elias replied. His winter sky eyes were steel now. Sarah, how many men are we talking about? Hard to say. I saw maybe a dozen altogether, but they weren't traveling together. Seemed like word had gotten out and every man with a gun was heading up to try his luck. Elias nodded grimly. They'll spread out, check every cabin and camp in these mountains. Most of them don't know the country, though. That gives us an advantage. What kind of advantage? Clara asked. Instead of answering directly, Elias went to a wooden chest in the corner of the cabin and pulled out several items: extra ammunition, a smaller rifle, rope, and what looked like camping supplies. We're going to make this place look abandoned, he said. Then we're going to disappear. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Into the mountains in winter? I know places they'll never find. Caves, hidden valleys, them places where a man or woman could wait out the worst of the winter if they had to. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. You're talking about abandoning your home. Your whole life is here. Elias looked around the cabin, at the carefully organized tools, the comfortable bed, the fireplace that had warmed him through 15 lonely winters. She could see what it cost him to consider leaving it all behind. Things can be replaced, he said quietly. Lives can't. But why? Clara's voice was barely a whisper. Why would you do this for someone you barely know? Elias was quiet for so long that Clara thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain and older wisdom. 15 years ago, when my Martha died, I thought the world had ended. Couldn't see past my own grief to notice that other people were hurting too, that they might need help. He met Clara's eyes. I turned my back on everything and everyone, came up here to hide from life. Maybe that was what I needed then. But hiding gets to be a habit, and habits can turn a man into something he doesn't much like. Sarah watched this exchange with knowing eyes, understanding something that Clara was only beginning to grasp. You don't owe me anything, Clara said desperately. No, Elias agreed, but I owe myself something. I owe it to myself to be the kind of man my Martha would have recognized. The kind who doesn't walk away when someone needs help. The three of them sat in heavy silence, the weight of the decision settling over them like snow. Outside, the mountain wilderness stretched in all directions, beautiful, dangerous, and vast enough to hide two people if they were clever and careful. "There's another way," Sarah said suddenly. "Might be we could get word to the territorial marshal, man named Grant who's been cleaning up some of the corruption in these parts." "How long would that take?" Elias asked. "Week, maybe 2, depending on weather and where he is." "Too long," Clara said. "Those men are already out there looking. And besides, it would be my word against Vernon's. Who's going to believe a woman with no money and no family over a mine foreman with influence?" Elias nodded grimly. "Sarah's right about Marshal Grant, though. He's one of the good ones. But Clara's also right. We can't wait around hoping justice will sort itself out." "So what do you propose?" Sarah asked. Elias went to the window and studied the terrain beyond his cabin. Clara could see him cataloging escape routes, defensible positions, water sources, all the things a man learned when survival depended on reading the land correctly. "We make them think we've run further than we have," he said finally. "Leave a trail heading east toward Colorado, but double back to the hidden valley above Willow Creek. There's an old trapper's shelter there, built into the rock face, warm, defensible, and invisible unless you know exactly where to look." "And then?" Clara asked. "Then we wait them out. Winter's hard on men who don't know these mountains. They'll give up when the weather turns worse, go back to easier prey." He turned from the window. "Come spring, when the passes open up, we can get word to Marshal Grant properly. By then, maybe some of the heat will have died down." Sarah finished her coffee and stood. "I'd better get back before someone notices I've been gone this long. But Elias, you be careful. Some of those men I saw looked like the type who'd shoot first and ask questions later. I'll keep that in mind." Sarah paused at the door, looking back at Clara with something like maternal concern. "You're braver than you know, girl. Don't let them convince you otherwise." After Sarah left, Clara and Elias spent the day preparing for what might be a long winter in hiding. They packed supplies, food, ammunition, warm clothes, basic tools. Everything had to fit in packs they could carry on foot through deep snow. As afternoon faded toward evening, Elias made one final check of his preparations. The cabin had to look abandoned, but not obviously so, as if the occupant had simply gone to check trap lines and hadn't returned. "We'll leave after dark," he said. "Follow the creek bed for the first mile. Harder to track in the water, even when it's partially frozen." Clara nodded, trying to ignore the fear gnawing at her stomach. She was about to venture into the wilderness with a man she had known for less than a week, running from enemies who wanted to see her hanged for a crime she hadn't committed. But as she watched Elias methodically prepare for their escape, checking and rechecking every detail, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the solid comfort of having someone competent on her side. Someone who wouldn't abandon her when things got difficult. "Elias," she said quietly as he banked the fire one last time. "Thank you for all of it." He looked at her across the cabin that had been her refuge, his expression serious. "Don't thank me yet. We've got a long, cold road ahead of us." "I know, but you could have turned me away that first night. Could have told Sarah you'd never seen me. Could have let those men search this place and take me back." She paused, struggling for words that could encompass what his kindness meant. "You chose to help me when you didn't have to. That matters." Elias shouldered his pack and picked up his rifle. "If they want to take you, Clara Hensley, they'll have to go through me first. And I promise you this, That won't be as easy as they think. As darkness fell over the Bitterroot Mountains, two figures slipped out of a cabin that had been a refuge and into a wilderness that would test everything they had learned about survival. Trust, and the courage to keep fighting when the odds seemed impossible. Behind them, the cabin sat empty and cold, waiting for whatever trouble would come looking in the morning. Part 4. Brief Days of Peace. The hidden valley lay cupped between granite walls like a secret the mountains kept to themselves. Snow drifted in gentle eddies here, sheltered from the worst winds by towering peaks on three sides. A stream ran unfrozen through the center, fed by hot springs that sent wisps of steam curling into the cold air. Clara stood at the entrance to the trapper's shelter, marveling at how perfectly concealed it was. Built into a natural cave in the rock face, expanded and improved by some long-dead mountain man. It was invisible until you were standing directly in front of it. The opening was hidden behind a curtain of icicles and wind-twisted pines. "How did you find this place?" she asked, watching Elias check the stone chimney that vented smoke through a crack in the rock overhead. "Old trapper named Jake Sullivan showed it to me. Must be 10 years ago now. He's the one who built most of this." Elias gestured around the shelter, stone walls fitted together without mortar, sleeping platforms carved from living rock. Storage niches that stayed dry year-round. Jake said it was his insurance policy. Place to come if the world went sideways. What happened to him? Grizzly, eventually. But he had 15 good years up here first. Elias began unpacking their supplies. Said a man could live through any winter in this valley, long as he had enough food and the sense not to go wandering in blizzards. They had been here 3 weeks now, and Clara was beginning to understand what Jake Sullivan had seen in this hidden sanctuary. The shelter was warm, dry, and surprisingly comfortable. The hot springs provided water that never froze, and Elias had shown her places where winter-hardy plants still grew, providing fresh greens to supplement their preserved food. More importantly, they had seen no sign of the men hunting for her. Their false trail heading east toward Colorado had apparently worked. The bounty hunters were following cold tracks through increasingly hostile terrain, while she and Elias lived in relative comfort in their mountain hideaway. "I'll check the snares," Elias said, shouldering his rifle. "You want to come along?" Clara nodded eagerly. After weeks of hiding, even a short expedition felt like freedom. She had learned to move quietly through the snow, to read tracks and signs, to spot the small movements that meant game was near. Elias was a patient teacher, and she was a motivated student. They made their way along the stream, checking the rabbit snares Elias had placed in natural runs between the rocks. The third snare held a fat snowshoe hare, which would mean fresh meat for dinner. "You're getting good at this," Elias observed as Clara reset the snare with practiced movements. "I had a good teacher." She straightened, brushing snow from her knees. "Back at the mining camp, I never imagined I could live like this. Catch my own food, find shelter, survive in the wilderness. Most people don't know what they're capable of until they have to find out." They continued along the stream, Clara marveling at how different the world looked through Elias's eyes. He saw stories written in tracks, read weather patterns in cloud formations, found food and medicine in plants she would have walked past without noticing. "There," he said suddenly, pointing to a stand of pine trees. "See the scratches on that trunk?" Clara studied the tree until she spotted what he meant. Long gouges in the bark, too regular to be natural. Bear? Black bear, marking his territory. Spring scratches, mostly healed over now. He's probably denned up for the winter somewhere higher up. Is that good or bad for us? Good. Mostly them black bears don't usually bother people if you leave them alone. And knowing where they are means knowing where not to go come spring when they wake up hungry and cranky. They made their way back to the shelter as afternoon shadows lengthened across the valley. Clara had grown to love this time of day, when the low sun turned the snow to gold and the peaks around them glowed like they were lit from within. "I never knew the mountains could be so beautiful," she said, stopping to watch the light play across the granite walls. "Most people see them as dangerous, hostile." Elias paused beside her. "But if you learn to work with them instead of fighting them, they can be peaceful." Clara glanced at him, hearing something in his voice she hadn't noticed before. "Is that why you stayed up here so long? The peace? Part of it?" He was quiet for a moment, his breath forming white puffs in the cold air. "Down in the towns, everything's about taking land, taking money, taking whatever you can get before someone else gets it first. Up here, it's different. You take what you need to survive, and you give back what you can." "What do you give back?" Elias gestured around the pristine valley. "You leave it better than you found it. You don't waste what the mountain provides. You respect the animals you hunt, the water you drink, the shelter that keeps you alive." He looked at her directly. "You help people when they need it." The simple statement carried weight that made Clara's chest tight with emotion. Here was a man who had chosen to live by principles that seemed old-fashioned in the rough-and-tumble world below. Honor, responsibility, care for those who couldn't care for themselves. That evening they cooked the rabbit over the small fire that vented through the hidden chimney. Clara had learned to prepare the meat properly, to use every part of the animal, to waste nothing. The work no longer bothered her. It seemed natural now. Part of the rhythm of survival. "Sarah will come back when she can," Elias said, banking the fire for the night. "Check if the bounty hunters have given up. Bring news from below. And if they haven't given up, then we wait longer." He settled onto his sleeping platform, wrapped in furs and blankets. "We've got supplies for the winter, and spring always comes eventually." Clara lay on her own platform, listening to the wind whisper through the pines outside their shelter. 3 weeks ago, the thought of spending months in hiding would have terrified her. Now, strange as it was, she felt safer here than she had anywhere in years. "Elias? Do you ever miss it? The life you had before?" He was quiet so long she thought he'd fallen asleep. When he finally answered, his voice was thoughtful. "I miss Martha every day. Miss the farm sometimes. The feeling of making something grow." He paused. "But I don't miss the fear." "What fear?" "Fear of losing it all again. Fear of caring about something so much that losing it would break you." She heard him shift in his bedding. Funny thing about hiding from life, though. After a while, you start to wonder if the fear of losing something is worse than never having it at all. Clara stared up at the rock ceiling, thinking about his words. She had spent years at the mining camp afraid of the men, afraid of being alone, afraid of standing up for herself. The fear had made her smaller, weaker, less than who she could be. "I was afraid too," she said quietly. "Afraid of what would happen if I said no to Vernon. Turns out what happened was exactly what I was afraid of. But you survived it. We survived it." She turned on her side to face his sleeping area, though she couldn't see him in the darkness. "I wouldn't have made it alone." "Maybe, maybe not, and you're stronger than you think." Clara Hensley. Over the following days, they fell into comfortable routines. Elias taught her to read weather signs, to predict when storms were coming. Clara learned to mend clothes with sinew and bone needles. to prepare herbal teas from pine needles and wild plants. They told each other stories to pass the long evenings, her tales of growing up on a hardscrabble farm in Kansas, his memories of the early days with Martha, slowly, without either of them quite noticing when it happened. The careful politeness between them gave way to something deeper. Clara found herself watching Elias as he worked, admiring the competent way he handled tools, the gentle care he showed for everything around him. She caught him looking at her sometimes too, his expression soft and wondering, as if he was seeing something he'd forgotten could exist. One evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Elias pulled something from his pack, a piece of antler he had been carving during the long winter nights. "He made this for you," he said simply, holding it out. Clara took it carefully, turning it over in her hands. It was a pendant, carved with delicate patterns that reminded her of snowflakes and pine boughs. A hole had been drilled through the top for a leather cord. "It's beautiful," she whispered, tracing the intricate designs with her fingertip. "Antler from a buck that lived in this valley. Figured you should have something to remember that you're still here." "Still fighting?" He cleared his throat, suddenly awkward. "That you're stronger than they thought." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. When was the last time someone had made something just for her? When had anyone taken the time to create beauty for no reason other than to give her joy? "Will you put it on me?" she asked. Elias threaded the pendant onto a leather cord with careful hands. When he leaned close to fasten it around her neck, Clara caught his scent, wood smoke and leather and something that was purely him. His fingers brushed her nape as he tied the cord, sending warmth down her spine. "Hey there," he said softly, sitting back. "Looks right on you." Clara touched the pendant where it rested against her throat. "Thank you. For this. For everything." She met his eyes across the small fire. "I know you didn't ask for any of this trouble." "No," Elias agreed, "but I'm not sorry it came." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning neither was quite ready to voice. Clara felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that went deeper than gratitude or companionship. This man had saved her life, but more than that, he had helped her remember who she was beneath the fear and desperation. "When this is over," she said carefully, "when it's safe for me to leave, what will you do?" Elias stoked the fire, considering. "Haven't thought that far ahead." "Will you go back to your cabin, to living alone?" "I don't know." He looked at her directly. "Will you go back to cooking in mining camps?" The question hit Clara with unexpected force. Would she? Could she go back to that life of servitude and constant vigilance, now that she had tasted something different? Now that she had learned she could trap rabbits and read weather signs and sleep safely beside a man who would never hurt her? "I don't know either," she admitted. They sat in comfortable silence, both lost in thoughts of futures that had seemed impossible just weeks before. Outside their hidden shelter, snow began to fall again, but Clara felt no fear of the storm. Here, in this secret valley with this quiet, strong man beside her, she had found something she had never expected. She had found home, not in a place, but in the feeling of being completely accepted for who she was, in the knowledge that someone would stand beside her against whatever came, not because they had to, but because they chose to. Clara touched the antler pendant at her throat and smiled. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own uncertainties. But tonight, she was exactly where she belonged. Part 5. The Storm and the Hunters. The blizzard came without warning, sweeping down from the high peaks like a living thing with teeth of ice and claws of wind. Clara woke to the sound of the storm hammering against the rock walls of their shelter. Snow driving through gaps she hadn't known existed. "How bad is it?" she asked, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders as she joined Elias at the shelter entrance. He peered through the curtain of falling snow, his face grim. "Bad. Wind's coming from the northwest. That means it'll blow for days." He turned back into the shelter. "Good thing we're not traveling in this." Clara nodded, grateful once again for their hidden sanctuary. Outside, visibility was less than 10 feet, and the wind howled like a pack of wolves. Anyone caught in the open would be lucky to survive an hour. They spent the morning reinforcing their defenses against the storm, hanging extra hides over the entrance, checking that their food supplies were secure, ensuring the chimney wouldn't get blocked by drifting snow. It was careful, methodical work that kept them busy while the world outside raged. It was near midday when Elias suddenly went still. His head tilted like he was listening to something beyond the storm's fury. "What is it?" Clara whispered. "Thought I heard." He moved to the entrance, pushing aside the heavy hide that covered it. Snow immediately began blowing into the shelter. "There. Voices." Clara strained to listen. At first she heard only wind, but then it came. Faint shouts carried on the howling air, the sound of men calling to each other through the storm. "They're out there," she breathed, fear turning her blood to ice. "In this weather?" Elias was already moving, gathering his rifle and ammunition. Desperate men do desperate things. $50 is more money than most of these men will see in a year. But how did they find us? Our trail led east. Maybe they lost the trail and decided to search everywhere. Elias checked his rifle with practiced efficiency. Or maybe someone got lucky and spotted our smoke. Clara felt the walls of their sanctuary closing in. After weeks of safety, the hunters had found them. And in this storm, there would be no escape. The valley had only one entrance, and it would be blocked by snow within hours. "How many do you think?" she asked, forcing herself to stay calm. "Hard to tell. At least 3, maybe more." Elias moved to one of the storage niches and pulled out a smaller rifle, the one he had brought for Clara. "You remember what I taught you about shooting?" Clara took the weapon with hands that trembled only slightly. "Aim low because the bullet rises. Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull. Breathe out before firing." "A good girl." Elias peered out through a gap in the hides. "They're working their way up the valley, checking every possible shelter. Won't be long before they find us." The voices were getting closer now, and Clara could make out individual words through the storm. Rough men shouting directions, cursing the weather, arguing about where to search next. "Clara Hensley," the voice cut through the wind like a blade. "We know you're out here somewhere. Come out peaceful-like, and nobody has to get hurt." Clara recognized the voice, one of Vernon Tate's men from the mining camp, a brutal man named Silas Crenshaw who had always looked at her like she was something he wanted to break. "You hear that, woman?" Another voice, closer now. $50 is good money, but we're freezing our backsides off in this storm. You come out now, we might even let you keep some fingers when we haul you back." Harsh laughter echoed off the valley walls. Clara gripped her rifle tighter, anger mixing with fear. These men weren't lawmen seeking justice. They were bounty hunters who would drag her back to whatever fate Vernon had planned. "They don't know exactly where we are," Elias said quietly. "That's something, but they'll find the shelter eventually if they keep looking." "What do we do?" Elias was quiet for a moment, studying the storm through the gap in the hides. When he spoke, his voice was steady and determined. "Hey, we're going to even the odds." "What do you mean?" 3 men in a blizzard, separated, half frozen and getting desperate. They're not thinking clearly, just following the money. Elias checked his ammunition again. I'm going to circle around behind them. Make them think there are more of us than they expect. No, Clara grabbed his arm. You can't go out in this storm. You'll freeze to death before you find them. I know this valley better than they do, know every rock, every tree. His winter sky eyes were calm but resolute. And I know how to move quiet in the snow. What about me? You stay here with the rifle. If anyone comes through that entrance who isn't me, you shoot them. He met her eyes seriously. Can you do that, Clara? If it comes down to your life or theirs? Clara thought about Vernon Tate, about being tied to that tree and left to die, about the cruel laughter of the men outside. These weren't good men who had made mistakes. They were predators who would hurt her for sport as much as money. Yes, she said firmly, I can do that. Elias nodded approvingly. That's my brave girl. He pulled on his heaviest coat and wrapped a scarf around his face. I'll be back before dark. If I'm not... He paused, then pulled something from his pack, a small bag of gold coins. Take this and head south when the storm breaks. Follow the stream down to the main river, then east toward Denver. Find Marshal Grant if you can. Elias, don't. I will be back, he said firmly. But if something goes wrong, you don't wait for me, you understand? Clara nodded, though the thought of leaving him made her chest tight with fear. Be careful. He squeezed her hand once, then slipped out through the entrance into the howling white madness of the storm. Clara watched until he disappeared, swallowed by the snow and wind as if he had never existed. The waiting was agony. Clara positioned herself where she could watch the entrance while staying hidden behind the stone walls. The voices of the hunters continued to echo through the valley, sometimes close, sometimes distant, as they worked their way through the storm. I found tracks here. The shout came from uncomfortably close. Leading toward those rocks. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. The tracks would be from their daily trips to check snares and gather firewood. Fresh enough to follow, even in the storm. About time. Silas Crenshaw's voice was nearer now. I'm tired of stumbling around in this white hell. Spread out, a third voice called. She might be armed. The sound of boots crunching through snow grew closer. Clara raised her rifle, sighting down the barrel toward the hidden entrance. Her hands were steady now, all fear burned away by cold determination. These men had chosen to hunt her like an animal. Now they would learn that cornered animals fight back. A figure appeared through the blowing snow, a man in a heavy coat, rifle in his hands, moving cautiously toward the shelter. Clara held her breath, finger on the trigger, waiting to see if it was friend or enemy. The man pushed aside the hide covering the entrance and stepped inside, snow swirling around him. Clara could see his face now, bearded, cruel, with small eyes that glittered with greed. Not Elias. Well, well, Silas Crenshaw said, lowering his rifle slightly as he spotted her. Look what we got here, the famous Clara Hensley, hiding in a cave like an animal. Please stay back, Clara warned, keeping her rifle trained on his chest. Silas laughed, a sound like breaking glass. You going to shoot me, girl? Don't think you got the stomach for it. He took a step closer. Besides, Vernon wants you back alive, says he's got some teaching to do before he hands you over to the law. I said stay back. Or what, you'll shoot an unarmed man? Silas held up his hands mockingly, though he kept his rifle ready. That'd make you a real outlaw, wouldn't it? You're not unarmed, and you're not a lawman. Clara's voice was steel. You're a bounty hunter who kidnapped me once and wants to do it again. Kidnapped? Silas's grin was ugly. Way I heard it, you stole money and ran. We're just bringing a thief back to face justice. The only thief here is Vernon Tate, and you know it. Silas took another step forward, and Clara could see the calculation in his eyes. He was trying to get close enough to rush her, to take the rifle before she could fire. "Last warning," she said. "You ain't going to—" The rifle boomed in the confined space, the sound deafening. Silas Crenshaw staggered backward, clutching his shoulder, his own weapon falling to the stone floor. "You shot me," he gasped, staring at the blood seeping between his fingers. "I aimed for your shoulder," Clara said, already reloading with the smooth motions Elias had taught her. "Next shot goes center mass." Silas glared at her with pure hatred, but he made no move to retrieve his fallen rifle. "You think this changes anything? There's 2 more of us out there, and your mountain man friend ain't coming back. We heard the shooting up in the rocks. Sounded like someone taking a bad fall." Clara's blood went cold, but she kept her rifle steady. "You're lying." "Maybe, maybe not." Silas pressed his hand tighter against his wounded shoulder. "Either way, you're coming with us. Question is whether you come easy or hard." Before Clara could respond, another figure burst through the entrance, but this one she recognized with a surge of relief that nearly buckled her knees. Elias? He was covered in snow, his face grim but unhurt. In his hands was a rifle that clearly wasn't his, taken from one of the other hunters. Clara realized. "You all right?" he asked, his eyes never leaving Silas. "I'm fine. I shot him in the shoulder." Good." Elias stepped fully into the shelter, and Clara could see he was favoring his left leg slightly. "The other 2 won't be troubling us anymore." "You killed them?" Silas demanded. "Didn't have to. Mountain took care of that." Elias's voice was cold as the storm outside. "Amazing how clumsy men get when they're stumbling around in a blizzard with someone shooting at them from cover. One fell into a crevasse. The other walked off a cliff trying to get away." Silas's face went pale beneath his beard. "You can't just leave me here to bleed." "Can't I?" Elias studied the wounded man with no sympathy. "You came up here to drag this woman back to whatever Vernon Tate had planned for her. You brought guns, brought violence to a place that should have been peaceful." He shook his head. "No, I don't think I owe you any kindness. The storm, it will pass, eventually. You might even live to see it end, if you're lucky." Elias gestured toward the entrance with his rifle. "Start walking." "You can't send me out in this. It's murder." "It's justice," Elias replied, "and same kind you planned for Clara, with no choice and no weapon." Silas stumbled toward the entrance. He paused at the threshold, looking back with eyes full of rage and fear. "This ain't over," he snarled. "Vernon's got friends, got money. He'll send more men." "Let him try," Elias said quietly. "But they better be better men than you." Silas disappeared into the storm, and Clara heard his curses fade into the howling wind. Elias dropped the heavy hide back over the entrance and turned to her. "Are you hurt?" she asked, noticing again how he favored his left leg. "Twisted my ankle some. Nothing serious." He set down the captured rifle and pulled off his snow-covered coat. "You did good, Clara. Stayed calm. Did what needed doing." Clara set down her own rifle with shaking hands. The reality of what had just happened was settling in. She had shot a man. Could have killed him if she'd aimed a few inches to the right. "I've never shot anyone before," she said quietly. "I didn't have a choice." Elias moved to her side, his presence warm and reassuring. "Those men came here to hurt you. You defended yourself. Will he make it out of the storm?" Elias looked toward the entrance, listening to the wind rage outside. "Hard to say. He's wounded. Doesn't know the country. And this storm's got hours left in it." He paused. "But that's not your concern anymore." Clara nodded, understanding. She had made her choice when she pulled the trigger. Whatever happened to Silas Crenshaw now was between him and the mountain. "Is it over?" she asked. "None, are we safe?" Elias was quiet for a long moment, banking the fire and checking their defenses. Then when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard experience. For now. But Silas was right about one thing. Vernon Tate won't give up easy. He's got too much pride invested in this. He met her eyes across the flickering firelight. "We've bought ourselves time. But this fight isn't finished." Outside, the storm continued to rage. But inside their hidden shelter, Clara felt a different kind of strength settling into her bones. She had faced armed men and fought back, had pulled the trigger when it mattered. She was no longer the frightened woman who had been tied to a tree and left to die. She was something harder now, something that could bite back when cornered. And beside her sat a man who would stand against any storm, face any danger, to keep her safe. The battle was far from over, but Clara Hensley was no longer running. She was ready to fight. Part 6. The Confrontation. 3 days after the storm passed, Elias made the decision that would change everything. Clara woke to find him cleaning his rifle with the methodical care of a man preparing for war. "We're going back," he said without looking up from his work. Back where?" Clara asked, though she already knew the answer. "To my cabin. To end this." Elias set down the rifle and met her eyes. "We can't spend the rest of our lives hiding in caves, Clara. And we can't keep running every time Vernon Tate sends men after you." Clara felt her stomach clench with familiar fear. It's too dangerous. There might be more bounty hunters down there, or there will always be more men like that, as long as there's money on your head. Elias stood and began packing supplies with decisive movements. "But I've been thinking about what Silas said before he died in the storm. About Vernon having friends, having influence. What about it? In men like Vernon, they're used to getting their way through fear, through making people too scared to fight back." Elias paused in his packing. "But they're also cowards at heart. Push back hard enough, make it costly enough, and they'll find easier prey." Clara shook her head. "You can't fight the whole mining camp, Elias, and you can't fight the law if Vernon's got the sheriff in his pocket. I'm not planning to fight anybody." A slight smile played at the corners of Elias's mouth. "I'm planning to make them fight each other." They left the hidden valley as the sun climbed over the eastern peaks, painting the snow-covered wilderness in shades of gold and rose. Clara felt exposed and vulnerable after weeks of hiding, every shadow potentially concealing an enemy. But Elias moved with quiet confidence, reading the land like a book, choosing paths that would keep them hidden from watching eyes. It took them most of the day to reach the ridge overlooking Elias's cabin. They crouched behind a stand of pine trees, studying the scene below through the clear mountain air. The cabin looked undisturbed, smoke curling peacefully from its chimney. But Clara could see signs that strangers had been there, tracks in the snow, disturbed wood piles, subtle changes that spoke of men searching for clues. "Someone's been living there," Elias observed. "Vernon's men? More likely drifters who found an empty cabin and decided to make themselves at home." Elias studied the approach routes, planning their descent. "We'll wait for dark, then go down and see who we're dealing with." As evening shadows lengthened across the valley, they made their way carefully down the slope. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs with every step, memories of that first terrible night flooding back. But this time was different. This time she carried a rifle and knew how to use it. This time she wasn't running. They reached the cabin just as full darkness settled over the mountains. Light showed through the single window, and Clara could hear voices inside, rough men talking and laughing over what sounded like a card game. Elias motioned for her to stay back while he crept closer to listen. When he returned, his expression was grim. 4 men, bounty hunters by the sound of it, still looking for you. They're drunk and getting careless. He checked his rifle one more time. Perfect. Perfect for what? For making them an offer they can't refuse. Before Clara could ask what he meant, Elias stepped into the circle of light cast by the cabin's window and called out in a voice that carried clearly through the thin walls. "Hey, you men inside, this is Elias Boone. This is my cabin you're squatting in." The voices inside went silent. Clara heard the scrape of chairs, the metallic click of weapons being readied. "E. Boone." The voice that answered was slurred with whiskey but alert with danger. "We've been looking for you. Where's the woman?" "Safe," Elias replied, "and she's going to stay that way." Harsh laughter echoed from the cabin. "You think so? There's 4 of us and 1 of you, old man. Vernon Tate's offering good money for that thieving woman, and we aim to collect." "I've got a better offer," Elias said calmly. "What kind of offer?" "In the kind that keeps you alive." Another silence, then the sound of urgent whispering. Clara crept closer, keeping to the shadows, her rifle ready. "You got our attention," the spokesman called finally. "But we ain't coming out to talk. You want to make a deal, you come in here." "Fair enough," Elias said, "but I'm coming in armed, and if any of you makes a wrong move, people are going to start dying." "Come ahead, then. But the woman comes too. We want to see her." Clara's blood went cold. This wasn't the plan, at least not any plan Elias had shared with her. But he turned and motioned for her to follow, his face calm and determined. "Trust me," he said quietly as she joined him at the cabin door. Elias kicked the door open and stepped inside, Clara close behind him. 4 men sat around his table, cards and whiskey bottles scattered between them. They were a rough bunch, unshaven, dirty, with the hard eyes of men who lived by violence. All 4 had weapons drawn and pointed at the doorway. "Well, well," the leader said, a scarred man with tobacco-stained teeth. "The famous Clara Hensley. You don't look like much for all the trouble you've caused." "Trouble I've caused?" Clara kept her rifle trained on the nearest man. "I defended myself against a man who tried to force himself on me. If that's trouble, then I'm proud to cause it. That's not what Vernon Tate says happened." "Vernon Tate is a liar." The leader shrugged. "Maybe. Don't much matter to us, and we're getting paid to bring you back, not to judge your character." He looked at Elias. "You said something about a better offer?" "I did." Elias stepped further into the cabin, his rifle held ready but not directly threatening. "Vernon's offering $50 for the woman, right?" "That's right." "I'll give you $75 to ride away and forget you ever saw her." The bounty hunters exchanged glances. $75 was serious money, more than most of them would see in months of honest work. "You got that kind of money?" the leader asked suspiciously. "I do." Elias reached slowly into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch that clinked with the sound of gold coins. "Question is, are you smart enough to take it?" "What's the catch?" "No catch. You take the money and ride south. Keep riding until you're out of Montana territory." Elias's voice was steady, reasonable. "In return, you forget you ever heard the name Clara Hensley." One of the younger bounty hunters leaned forward eagerly. "That's more money than Vernon's offering, Jake, and a lot less risky than dragging a woman back to face whatever he's got planned." The leader, Jake, scowled at his companion. "Shut up, Charlie." He looked back at Elias. "What if Vernon sends more men? What if the law comes looking?" "That's not your problem anymore." Elias set the money pouch on the table, well within reach of the 4 men. "You take this deal, and you're out of it clean." Jake stared at the pouch, clearly tempted. But Clara could see the greed warring with something else in his eyes. Fear of crossing Vernon Tate, perhaps, or simple suspicion of anything that seemed too good to be true. "I don't like it," Jake said finally. "It smells like a trap. Only trap here is the one you're walking into if you try to take the woman." Elias replied calmly. "He big talk for a man outnumbered 4-1. Elias smiled, and Clara felt a chill at the coldness in his expression. "You think you're the only ones with friends in these mountains?" As if summoned by his words, a voice called out from the darkness beyond the cabin. "Jake Morrison, this is Sheriff Thomas Grant. You and your men are surrounded." Clara's heart leaped. The territorial marshal Sarah had mentioned. He had found them somehow, arrived at exactly the right moment. The 4 bounty hunters went pale, their weapons swinging toward the windows as they tried to see into the darkness outside. "That's impossible," Jake breathed. "How did—" Elias Boone sent word through Sarah Martinez at the way station. Sheriff Grant's voice continued. "We've been tracking you men for 2 days, waiting for the right moment." Clara looked at Elias with new understanding. This had been his plan all along, not to fight the bounty hunters, but to arrange for proper law enforcement to handle them. "You set us up," Jake snarled, raising his rifle toward Elias. "I offered you a fair deal," Elias replied, "and you chose not to take it." "Jake Morrison," Sheriff Grant called again. "You're wanted for questioning in the death of a man named Silas Crenshaw. His body was found 3 days ago, along with evidence linking him to your group." Jake's face went white. Silas had died in the storm after all, and now the law was involved. "We didn't kill Silas," Charlie protested. "He went after the woman on his own." "Tell it to a judge," Grant replied. "Right now, you men need to put down your weapons and come out peaceful-like." "Like hell," Jake swung his rifle toward Clara. "If we're going down, we're taking—" The shot came from the darkness outside, precise and devastating. Jake Morrison spun and fell, his rifle clattering across the wooden floor. The other 3 bounty hunters dropped their weapons immediately, hands raised in surrender. "Anyone else feeling brave?" Sheriff Grant asked mildly. The remaining bounty hunters stumbled toward the door, hands high, defeated men who had bet on the wrong side and lost everything. Clara watched them go, hardly able to believe it was over. After months of running and hiding, justice had finally arrived in the form of a territorial marshal who couldn't be bought or intimidated. Sheriff Grant appeared in the doorway, a weathered man in his 50s with steel-gray hair and the kind of steady eyes that had seen everything the frontier could offer. He tipped his hat politely to Clara. "Miss Hensley, I presume? I've been wanting to speak with you about Vernon Tate and his operation at the Willow Creek mine." "You believe me?" Clara asked, hardly daring to hope. "Ma'am, I've been investigating reports of corruption and violence at mining camps throughout this territory. Your case isn't the first complaint against Vernon Tate, just the first witness brave enough to come forward." Grant's expression was grim. "With your testimony, we can finally put that man where he belongs." Clara felt something tight in her chest finally begin to loosen. After all the fear, all the running, someone in authority was finally listening. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we ride down to Willow Creek and have a conversation with Mr. Tate," Sheriff Grant said. "And this time, he won't be able to silence the witness or buy his way out of trouble." Clara looked at Elias, seeing her own relief reflected in his winter sky eyes. The nightmare was ending at last. Vernon Tate would face justice, and she would be free to choose her own path. But as she watched the bounty hunters being led away in chains, Clara realized something important. She already knew what path she wanted to choose. It led right back to this cabin, to this mountain, to the man who had saved her life and shown her what it meant to be truly free. The confrontation was over. Now came the harder part, deciding what to do with the life she had fought so hard to reclaim. Part 7. Building a home. Spring came to the Bitterroot Mountains like a promise kept after a long, harsh winter. The snow began its retreat in March, revealing patches of dark earth that steamed in the warming sun. By April, wildflowers dotted the meadows in splashes of purple and yellow, and the creek that ran past Elias's cabin swelled with snowmelt from the high peaks. Clara stood in the doorway of what was no longer just Elias's cabin, watching him work on the foundation of the new addition. 2 months had passed since Sheriff Grant had taken Vernon Tate away in chains, along with 3 of his cronies who had been taking bribes to look the other way. The territorial court had been swift in its judgment. Vernon would spend the next 15 years breaking rocks in the territorial prison, and Clara was officially cleared of all charges. She was free to go anywhere, do anything, be anyone she chose to be on, and she had chosen to stay. "You're going to wear a hole in that doorframe, standing there staring," Elias called, not looking up from the log he was shaping with his adze. "Just watching you work," Clara replied, unable to keep the smile from her voice. "Making sure you're building those walls straight. You've been building things longer than you've been alive, woman." "Not that much longer," Clara protested, though she knew he was probably right. She had never asked his exact age, and he had never offered it. Some things didn't need saying between them. The addition was taking shape nicely. A proper bedroom to replace the single sleeping area. A larger kitchen with space for the cast-iron stove they had ordered from Denver. And most importantly, a guest room for the travelers who had begun seeking them out. It had started with Sheriff Grant, who had stopped by in late February to check on Clara and had stayed 3 days. Resting his horse and enjoying what he called the first decent meal and peaceful sleep I've had in months. Word had spread from there, carried by the network of trappers, prospectors, and wanderers who moved through the high country. Boone's Hearth, they were calling it now. A place where a man could find a hot meal, a warm bed, and conversation that didn't involve cards or whiskey or bragging about who had killed what. Clara had initially worried about the attention, but Elias had convinced her that being known for hospitality was better protection than isolation. Besides, he had said with that rare smile that still made her heart flutter, "Martha always wanted to run a proper guest house. Seems fitting that we should finally give her that dream." The word still sent warmth through Clara's chest every time she heard it. Sometime during the long winter in hiding, she and Elias had stopped being 2 people thrown together by circumstance and had become something more solid, more permanent. They hadn't discussed it formally. Mountain people weren't much for long speeches about feelings. But the understanding was there in the way he asked her opinion before making decisions, in the way she mended his shirts without being asked, in the 1,000 small courtesies that built a life together. Clara. The call came from down the trail, and she looked up to see Sarah Martinez riding toward the cabin, her sturdy bay picking its way carefully through the muddy patches left by melting snow. "Sarah!" Clara wiped her hands on her apron and went to greet her friend. Sarah had become a regular visitor, bringing news from the valley and staying to help with the guests who were becoming more frequent as word of their hospitality spread. "Good timing," Sarah said, dismounting and tying her horse to the hitching post Elias had installed outside the cabin. "I passed a family about 5 miles down the trail, heading to Oregon by the look of them. Wagon broke down, and they've got children with them." Clara was already moving, her mind shifting to the familiar rhythms of preparation. "How many?" 6, including 3 young ones, and they'll need hot food and dry beds. "We can manage that." Clara glanced toward Elias, who had stopped work and was listening to the conversation. "Can you ride down and help them with the wagon?" Already hitching the horses, he replied. And Clara felt that familiar warmth at how well they worked together, anticipating each other's thoughts and needs. Within an hour, the family had arrived. James and Mary Patterson with their 3 children, heading west to start a new life in the Oregon Territory. The youngest, a girl of perhaps 6, was running a fever, and Mary Patterson looked exhausted from weeks of difficult travel. "Welcome to Boone's Hearth," Clara said, helping Mary down from the wagon seat. "Let's get you all inside where it's warm." The next few hours passed in the familiar blur of feeding hungry travelers and making them comfortable. Clara had discovered she had a gift for this work, reading what people needed before they asked, creating an atmosphere of warmth and safety that made even the wariest travelers relax. Elias and James worked on the broken wagon wheel while Clara and Sarah tended to the sick child and prepared enough food for a small army. The cabin filled with the sounds of family life, children's laughter, quiet conversation, the clatter of dishes and cutlery. "You're natural at this," Mary Patterson said, watching Clara efficiently manage the chaos of feeding 6 unexpected guests. "Have you been running a guest house long?" "Not long," Clara replied, checking the cornbread in the oven. "We only started this past winter." "Oh well, you have a gift for it, and your husband clearly knows his way around broken wagon wheels." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Elias isn't. We're not." She trailed off, realizing she didn't know how to explain their relationship to strangers. Mary's eyes twinkled with understanding. "Forgive me for assuming, but the way you 2 work together, the way he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching." She smiled knowingly. "I've been married 20 years, dear. I know what love looks like." That evening, after the Patterson family had been settled in the guest room and the cabin had grown quiet, Clara found herself standing on the front porch, looking up at the stars that blazed in the clear mountain sky. The air was soft with the promise of summer, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers. Elias joined her, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. They stood in comfortable silence, listening to the creek murmur in the darkness and the distant call of an owl hunting in the forest. "And Mary Patterson thought we were married," Clara said quietly. "Did she now?" Elias's voice was carefully neutral. "I didn't know what to tell her." "What did you want to tell her?" Clara turned to look at him, studying his profile in the starlight. "I wanted to tell her yes." Elias was quiet for a long moment, sipping his coffee and considering her words. When he spoke, his voice was soft with something that might have been wonder. "I never thought I'd want that again. After Martha died, I figured I was done with all of that. Done with caring about someone so much that losing them could break you. And now I think maybe being broken once doesn't mean you can't heal stronger." He turned to meet her eyes. "You've changed something in me. Clara Hensley. Made me remember what it feels like to build something instead of just surviving." Clara set down her coffee cup and moved closer to him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. "You saved my life that night in the storm. You saved mine too, just took me longer to realize it. Elias, I know I'm not much of a catch, old mountain man set in his ways, more comfortable with trees than people most days." His voice was uncertain in a way she had never heard before. "But if you're willing, if you think you could build a life up here with me." Clara reached up and touched his face, feeling the roughness of his beard beneath her palm. "I already have built a life here with you. The only question is whether we want to make it official." Elias covered her hand with his own, and Clara could see the emotion in his winter sky eyes. "Clara Hensley, will you marry me?" "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will." He kissed her then. soft and sweet under the mountain stars, and Clara felt something settle into place in her chest. This was home, not just the cabin or the valley, but this man who had seen her at her most broken and helped her become stronger than she had ever imagined possible. They were married 3 weeks later in a ceremony that perfectly reflected their unconventional courtship. Sheriff Grant performed the service. Sarah Martinez stood as witness, and a dozen friends from the scattered mountain community gathered to celebrate. The Patterson family, whose wagon Elias had repaired, delayed their journey west by 2 days to attend. Clara wore a simple blue dress that Sarah had helped her sew, and Elias had trimmed his beard and put on his one good shirt. They exchanged vows on the porch of their cabin, with the Bitterroot Mountains rising majestically behind them and wildflowers blooming in the meadow below. "I do you, Elias Boone, take Clara Hensley to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live." "I do," Elias said, his voice steady and sure. "And do you, Clara Hensley, take Elias Boone to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live?" Clara looked into the eyes of the man who had saved her life and given her a purpose, who had stood between her and danger without hesitation, who had helped her discover strength she never knew she possessed. "I do," she said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "I then, by the authority vested in me by the territory of Montana, I pronounce you husband and wife. Elias, you may kiss your bride." And he did, to the cheers and applause of their friends, while the mountain wind sighed through the pines and the creek sang its eternal song of water over stone. That night, as they lay together as husband and wife for the first time, Clara thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment, from that terrible night when she had been tied to a tree and left to die, through the long winter of hiding and healing, to this perfect spring evening when she had found not just safety but love. "No regrets?" Elias asked softly, his arm around her as they listened to the familiar sounds of their mountain home. "None," Clara replied, touching the antler pendant he had carved for her, which she still wore every day. "This is exactly where I belong." Outside their window, the night breeze carried the scent of pine and possibility, and in the distance, the mountains stood eternal and protective against the star-filled sky. Clara Boone, she would have to get used to that name, smiled and settled deeper into her husband's arms. She was home at last. Part 8, The Invitation. 2 years had passed since that spring wedding, and Boone's hearth had become exactly what Clara and Elias had dreamed it would be. The addition was complete now, with 4 guest rooms that stayed occupied more often than not during the traveling season. Word had spread throughout the mountain territories about the couple who offered genuine hospitality in the high country. Hot meals, clean beds, and the kind of peaceful atmosphere that weary travelers treasured. Clara stood at the kitchen window, watching the golden light of evening paint the mountainsides in shades of amber and rose. The aspen trees had turned brilliant yellow, their leaves trembling in the gentle breeze like thousands of golden coins. October in the Bitterroots was her favorite time of year. The harsh heat of summer was past, but winter's bite hadn't yet settled into the valleys. Behind her, she could hear the quiet murmur of conversation from the main room, where their current guests, a geological survey team from the territorial government, were playing cards after a satisfying dinner of venison stew and fresh bread. Elias was with them, sharing stories of the country they were mapping, his deep voice carrying the authority of someone who had walked every mile of these mountains. Clara dried her hands on her apron and stepped out onto the front porch, breathing in the crisp air that carried hints of wood smoke and approaching frost. The vegetable garden she had planted that first spring had grown into something substantial. Neat rows of late potatoes, winter squash, and hearty greens that would see them through the cold months ahead. Root vegetables were stored in the cellar Elias had dug, along with preserved meat and the dozens of jars of berries and vegetables Clara had put up during the abundant summer. Mrs. Boone, one of the survey team members, a young man named David Chen, appeared in the doorway. "My colleagues and I wanted to thank you again for the excellent meal. We've been camping for weeks, and a home-cooked dinner feels like heaven." "You're very welcome," Clara replied, genuinely pleased. "Will you be staying long in the area?" "A few more days, mapping the mineral deposits in the high country. Though I have to say, the idea of spending winter in a place like this has its appeal." David looked around at the peaceful valley, the mountains rising protectively on all sides. "How do you stand the isolation, though? Don't you ever miss civilization?" Clara considered the question as she had many times before. "This is civilization," she said finally. "Maybe not the kind you find in cities, but the kind that matters. People helping each other, sharing what they have, treating everyone with respect regardless of where they come from or what they've done in the past." David nodded thoughtfully. "I suppose there's something to be said for that. Most of the mining camps we've surveyed are pretty rough places." "They don't have to be," Clara said, "but it takes people choosing to make them better." After David went back inside, Clara remained on the porch, watching the last light fade from the western peaks. These quiet moments had become precious to her. Time to reflect on how much her life had changed, how far she had traveled from that terrified woman who had been tied to a tree and left to die. "Penny, for your thoughts." Elias's voice was warm as he joined her, slipping his arms around her waist from behind. "Just thinking about how different things are now." Clara leaned back against his solid chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. 2 years ago, I couldn't have imagined any of this. Any regrets? It was a question he asked sometimes, usually in quiet moments like this. Clara knew it came from his own experience of loss, his understanding of how quickly life could change, how precious happiness was because it could be taken away without warning. "None," she said, as she always did. "Well, maybe one small one." "What's that?" "I wish we could have had children." The words came out more wistfully than she had intended. It was something they had both hoped for but had learned to accept might not happen. At 32, Clara knew her chances grew slimmer with each passing year. Elias tightened his arms around her. "We've got something pretty good here. Just the two of us." "We do," Clara agreed. "And who knows? Maybe we're meant to be the kind of parents who help other people's children. Like that Patterson girl who was so sick when they stayed with us. Her mother still writes to tell us how well she's doing in Oregon." "Speaking of which," Elias said, his voice taking on a different tone, "we had a visitor today while you were in town getting supplies." "Oh, anyone interesting?" "Young woman, traveling alone. Said she was looking for work." Elias paused. She was in pretty rough shape, Clara. Looked like she'd been on the trail for weeks, and she had that scared look in her eyes. The kind you had when I first found you. Clara turned in his arms to face him. "Where is she now?" "I told her to come back tomorrow. Figured you'd want to talk to her before we decided anything." Elias studied Clara's face in the gathering darkness. "But I got the feeling she's running from something. Or someone." Clara felt a familiar stirring in her chest, the same protective instinct that had made her want to help the Patterson family. That drove her to create a place where weary travelers could find safety and comfort. "We'll talk to her," she said decisively. "If she needs help, we'll figure out how to give it." "I thought you'd say that." Elias smiled, the expression visible even in the dim light. One of the things I love about you. Clara Boone. You've got room in your heart for strays. Takes one to know one, Clara replied, remembering her own desperate arrival on this mountain. Besides, didn't you once tell me that helping people was what made life worth living? The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost sparkling on the brown grass and the creek running dark between banks already touched with ice. Clara was mixing biscuit dough when she heard the sound of a horse approaching slowly up the trail. Through the kitchen window, she could see a figure on horseback, a young woman bundled in a coat too big for her, sitting carefully as if she was sore or injured. The horse was a good one, Clara noted, but both rider and mount looked tired and travel-worn. Elias went out to greet the visitor while Clara continued her breakfast preparations, adding extra eggs to the pan and putting more coffee on to brew. Whatever this young woman's story was, she would tell it better with hot food in her belly. "Clara," Elias called from the main room, "I'd like you to meet Miss Rebecca Torres." Clara wiped her hands and went to greet their visitor. The young woman was perhaps 20, with dark hair and intelligent brown eyes that held the same wariness Clara remembered from her own early days here. She was prettier than she probably realized, with fine features and a natural grace that spoke of good breeding. But there was something brittle about her, as if she was holding herself together through sheer force of will. "Miss Torres," Clara said warmly, "welcome to Boone's Hearth. I hope you'll join us for breakfast." "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Boone." Rebecca's voice was cultured, with a slight accent that Clara couldn't quite place. "I don't want to impose, but I confess I haven't had a proper meal in several days." "No imposition at all, that's what we're here for." Clara gestured toward the table. "Please sit down. You look like you could use some warming up." Over breakfast, Rebecca's story emerged in careful pieces. She had been traveling for 3 weeks, working her way north from Colorado. She had experience as a seamstress and could cook, clean, and tend to household duties. She was looking for honest work in a place where she could start over, leave her past behind. What she didn't say was as telling as what she did. She never mentioned family, never explained why she was traveling alone, never specified what she was leaving behind in Colorado. But Clara saw the flinch when a door banged in the wind, noticed how Rebecca's eyes automatically tracked the exits, observed the way she kept her hands ready to move quickly. After breakfast, Clara showed Rebecca around the guest house while Elias tended to her horse. The young woman was impressed by the clean, comfortable rooms, the well-organized kitchen, the evidence of prosperity built through honest work. "It's wonderful," Rebecca said as they stood in the main room. Morning sunlight streaming through the windows Elias had installed to give the space an open, welcoming feel. "You've built something really special here." "We've been blessed," Clara replied. "But it's also been a lot of work. We could use help, especially with winter coming on. There's always washing and mending to be done, meals to prepare, rooms to clean." She paused, studying Rebecca's face. "The question is, are you running towards something or away from it?" Rebecca's composure cracked slightly. "Does it matter?" "It might. We've had guests who were running from the law, from debts, from angry husbands or fathers. Most of the time, we don't ask questions. But if you're going to stay here, work with us, become part of what we're building." Clara's voice was gentle but firm. "We need to know you won't bring trouble down on the people we're trying to help." Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the mountains that rose like protective walls around the valley. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I was engaged to be married, to a man my father chose, a wealthy man, influential in our community." She swallowed hard. "He was also cruel. When I tried to break the engagement, My father said I had no choice, that I belonged to my fiancée now, whether I liked it or not. Clara felt cold anger settle in her stomach. So you ran? I ran, took my horse and what money I could gather, and I've been traveling ever since. Rebecca met Clara's eyes. I won't go back. I'd rather die than marry that man. You won't have to, Clara said firmly. If you want to stay here, work with us, you're welcome. We don't ask questions about people's pasts, and we don't let anyone take our people away against their will. Relief flooded Rebecca's face. You mean that? I mean it, Clara smiled, remembering another frightened woman who had found refuge in these mountains. I know what it's like to run from men who think they own you. You're safe here, Rebecca Torres, for as long as you want to stay. That evening, after the survey team had departed and Rebecca had been settled into one of the guest rooms, Clara and Elias sat together on their porch as they did every night. The first snow of the season was beginning to fall, light flakes that danced in the lamplight spilling from their windows. Another stray, Elias observed, his tone fondly amused. Another person who needed help, Clara corrected. Besides, we really could use the assistance. The word about this place is spreading, and we're getting more guests every season. I'm not complaining, just noting that you've got a talent for attracting people who need saving. Clara considered this as she watched the snow begin to accumulate on the porch railing. Maybe that's what we're meant to do. Create a place where people can heal, can start over, can remember what it feels like to be safe. Like you did. Like we both did. Clara turned to look at her husband, this steady, strong man who had chosen to share his solitary life with her. You saved me that night in the storm. But I think maybe I saved you too. Elias was quiet for a moment, watching the snow fall in the golden pool of light from their windows. You know what Martha used to say about love? What? She said love wasn't something you fell into, like a hole in the ground. She said it was something you chose to build, day by day, choice by choice. He took Clara's hand in his, their fingers intertwining naturally. Said the strongest love was the kind that grew up from solid ground, with deep roots that could weather any storm. Clara felt warmth spread through her chest despite the cold air. I love you, Elias Boone. I love you too, Clara Boone. He squeezed her hand gently. Think we've built something pretty strong here. I think we have. Clara looked around at their domain, the sturdy cabin that had become a true home, the guest rooms where weary travelers found rest, the valley that had sheltered and nurtured them through every season. And I think we're just getting started. As if summoned by her words, a light appeared in Rebecca's window, the young woman settling in for her first night of safety and longer than she could probably remember. Soon there would be others. Clara knew. People running from violence, from poverty, from despair. People who needed to remember that kindness still existed in the world. Live with me, Elias had said to her that first night when she was broken and terrified and certain she would never feel safe again. Now she understood that the invitation had been bigger than just survival, deeper than just shelter from the storm. It had been an invitation to build something lasting, something that could offer hope to others the way it had offered hope to her. The snow continued to fall, blanketing their mountain refuge in pristine white. And Clara Boone smiled as she contemplated the winters and springs and summers yet to come. Whatever they brought, she and Elias would face them together, their love growing stronger with each passing season, their hearts always open to the next soul in need of sanctuary. In the distance, a wolf howled its lonely song, but here on the porch of Boone's hearth, surrounded by warmth and light and love, Clara felt nothing but deep, abiding peace. Home, she was finally completely, eternally home.